Hello again everyone, and welcome back. Harvest is in full swing, and it's finally time for another guide. In this one, I'll be covering my take on the self-cast Ice Nova Hierophant. Fueled by our Ascendancy and choice of unique staff, we'll be rapidly unleashing colossal Ice Novas that repeat 3 additional times per cast, and we can cast Ice Nova in a variety of ways. First, from our character directly, achieving nearly screen-wide area of effect, though this isn't recommended as it locks us in place and we have more efficient means of dealing damage. Far better to cast from our Frostbolt projectiles, with a single cast of Ice Nova triggering on up to 2 Frostbolts at once. The resounding repeats occur automatically as the Frostbolts travel, and don't require continued casting from us. As a result, we can rapidly stack a huge amount of Ice Novas, and let the repeats do the work. This frees us to move around, engage new targets, or even loot, and results in some quick, satisfying gameplay. When facing down hordes of enemies, you can make phenomenal use of Vaal Ice Nova, which creates a massive chain reaction that easily decimates densely packed mobs in a variety of league mechanics. This can also be used defensively if surrounded to quickly clear away everything nearby. When fighting bosses, continuous casting builds up a staggering amount of repeating Novas. The more we cast, the more intensity we gain, focusing our Novas into a cataclysm of icy death, capable of dealing crushing damage. Most bosses will be chain frozen permanently, completely nullifying them as threats. Extremely active bosses can be tough to hit consistently, and proper timing is required to achieve optimal DPS against them. Defensively, the build makes full use of Mind Over Matter to extend our usable life pool. The core version of the build can push over 10,000 life, energy shield, and unreserved mana combined, while the tanky version can push as high as 13,000. We'll be sustaining this with life and energy shield leech, as well as rapid mana recovery and regeneration. The build also manages some reasonable block and spell block chance, consistently chills and freezes just about everything, has high mobility and flexible casting, and blinds everything we chill, increasing our chance to evade dramatically. With significant investment into our life, energy shield, and unreserved mana pools, alongside some minor defensive alterations, this build can be made suitable for hardcore, but will likely not be top tier. Gearing up this build is very affordable. Great performance can be achieved on a reasonable budget, with additional room to scale. With optional upgrades, many of our most important items are surprisingly cheap uniques, and the majority of our other gear is composed of flexible rares. Only our best in slot amulet, the Pandemonious, poses any major expense, and there are cheaper alternatives to consider. None of the uniques used are strictly needed for the build to function, and some of the core pieces have farmable divination cards. As a result, this is doable as both a league starter and in solo self-found, but performance will likely suffer until at least a pledge of hands can be obtained. Fortunately, these tend to be quite affordable even very early in the league. Personally, this is one of my favorite playstyles of all time. The versatility, cast speed, and shatters make it very satisfying to play. If you'd like to wield devastating area of effect, stack absurd amounts of Ice Novas to annihilate bosses, or trigger massive chain explosions, this build is an easy recommendation. Now let's take a deeper look at just how to make it happen. This guide utilizes the free program Path of Building to summarize and display its key information. Simply copy in the pastebin link below and you'll have access to everything you'll need, including multiple gear sets and skill trees for the various stages of progression. If you're watching this in a league following 3.11, the Path of Building will have been updated. Changes made will be listed in the video description or notes section of the POB. If you're enjoying the guide so far, consider subbing for more just like it. Now let's get started by taking a look at our primary endgame skill tree and the modifiers that drive the build. Offensively, these are the common modifiers we'll be looking for and the major nodes that benefit us the most. The build wields a staff, casts exclusively spells, deals 100% cold damage, and scales critical strikes. No keystones will be used offensively in this build. A fair amount of our power will come from placing jewels in many convenient sockets across the tree. Defensively, these are the common modifiers we'll be looking for and the major nodes that benefit us best. The build primarily scales life and mana, bolsters block and spell block chance, leeches both life and energy shield, and improves mana regeneration as well. We'll be picking up 1 defensive keystone Mind Over Matter to extend our usable life pool to our unreserved mana. In the primary version of the build, we'll be increasing the effectiveness of Mind Over Matter with specific ascendancies and gear choices. The higher the percentage of damage taken from mana before life, the higher we can scale our mana pool effectively, with each investment increasing our potential tankiness considerably. Jewel sockets will also be used defensively to scale life, mana, and necessary resistances. For those wanting to go as defensive as possible, I'll be including an alternative skill tree that can push the build up towards 13,000 total life, energy shield, and unreserved mana. This hinges upon having 60% of damage taken from mana before life, and requires a somewhat expensive Watcher's Eye to make happen. And for those wanting to maximize offensive output, I'll be including a partial and fully optimized set of Cluster Jewel skill trees. However, Cluster Jewels are not as cheap as they once were. This will be a more expensive route than the primary tree, but can be well worth it. I'll be discussing this in more detail in the Cluster Jewels section of the guide. Working in tandem with our skill tree is our Ascendancy of Hierophant. Let's briefly discuss the nodes we'll be using and my recommended order for picking them up. First and foremost, we have Sanctuary of Thought, a perfect showcase of why Hierophant works so well over other options. When the build is optimized, this node alone grants us over 1000 energy shield, increases the area of effect of our Ice Novas by a staggering 80%, and makes our rapid expenditure of mana dramatically easier to sustain by cutting the cost of our skills in half. Without this node, we can easily spend over 500 mana per second when actively casting Ice Nova, an amount that other Ascendancies can really struggle to sustain, but Hierophant, in comparison, barely notices. Our next node is Divine Guidance, which heavily increases our maximum mana, grants Transfiguration of Mind, which itself makes increases to maximum mana also apply to damage at 30% of their total value. And finally, the node also improves the effectiveness of Mind over Matter by causing 10% of damage to be taken from mana before life. Our third node is Conviction of Power, which provides frequent power charges upon killing enemies, and the occasional endurance charge to go with it. If we have at least a single power charge, our damage will penetrate 5% of enemy elemental resistances. With a single endurance charge, we'll take 5% less elemental damage. And that brings us to our final node, Illuminated Devotion, a simple node that conditionally grants us increased area of effect, spell damage, and the incredibly beneficial ability to leech life with spell damage. It only requires that we have Arcane Surge active, a buff that we'll have up just about permanently, as it will be triggered consistently when we cast certain spells. When picking up your Ascendancies, here's my recommended but flexible order. Begin with Illuminated Devotion, as we can easily gain the full value out of it throughout the leveling process, followed up with Divine Guidance and Sanctuary of Thought, as both of these require at least a bit of investment before you can get some good value out of them. In the mid-game is when that really begins to occur. When you complete your Uber Lab, wrap things up with Conviction of Power, as it is simply our most lackluster Ascendancy node and can be easily left until later. Forging onward, let's briefly talk about our bandit selection. We can get fantastic use from helping Alira or killing all of the bandits. Personally, I recommend siding with Alira at least early on, as it makes our leveling experience smoother, gearing easier, and provides a decent chunk of damage as well. In the late game, if you can shore up all of your resistance issues to the point where Alira is no longer necessary, I advise transitioning to the 2 passive points with a Book of Reform. Let's continue moving and take a look at the best Pantheons available. Regardless of what you choose, be sure to collect all of the additional souls. For the Major God, the Brine King should be used at least early on. It helps prevent incoming stuns from becoming lethal, and that can make a big difference. There's no harm in sticking with it permanently, but if you can shore up stun immunity through gear to a point you're feeling comfortable, consider switching over to something like Lunaris for the variety of benefits that it grants. For the Minor God, the choice is incredibly flexible. We can gain reasonable benefits from options like Relikesh, Gruthkul, Shikari, and Abarath. And for longer boss fights, swapping into Rislatha is an easy recommendation to ensure that our life flask is consistently available. Now let's continue onward and dive into the skills and links that power the build, beginning first with our Vaal Ice Nova setup. This will be a 6 link, socketed directly into our endgame weapon, the Pledge of Hands. Prioritize getting a level 21 Vaal Ice Nova, as each additional level increases the base damage of the skill heavily. Pledge of Hands automatically supports socketed gems with a level 30 Greater Spell Echo, effectively turning this setup into a 7 link. Greater Spell Echo causes our Ice Novas to repeat an additional 2 times, heavily increasing the potency of our damage output. Unfortunately, Ice Novas cast on Frostbolt projectiles aren't technically considered repeats, and as a result, the other benefits granted by Greater Spell Echo won't affect our main form of casting Ice Nova. Regardless, our first direct support gem is the regular Spell Echo, which grants Ice Nova with a ridiculous 70% more cast speed and an additional repeat, but coming at the cost of dealing 10% less damage. This gem combined with Greater Spell Echo brings the total number of repeats up to 3. Hypothermia grants up to 40% more damage against chilled enemies, and also buffs the chills that we inflict. Controlled Destruction provides up to 45% more spell damage, but in return, lowers critical strike chance by 100%. It sounds severe, but in practice, will only lower our effective critical strike chance by around 6%, and the damage increase is well worth it. If you have the spare currency, consider upgrading to an Awakened Controlled Destruction. Next, we have Intensify support, which grants a stack of intensity every time we use Ice Nova. With minor investment on the skill tree, we can reach a maximum of 5 stacks. Each active stack grants 16% more area damage, but also reduces area of effect by 12%. These stacks are lost over time if we start moving, or lost instantly if we teleport. Fortunately, the gem always grants up to 55% increased area of effect. This helps offset a bit of its downside, and keeps our mapping smooth at low intensity. When fighting bosses, we tend to cast a lot of Ice Novas at once, and quickly reach maximum intensity. This heavily reduces our area of effect, but grants up to an impressive 80% more damage. In the remaining socket, we can utilize a variety of options. The classic Inspiration support provides fantastic damage at full charges, but due to the high mana cost of Ice Nova, it will have partial downtime when regaining its charges. Alternatively, options like added cold damage or cold penetration support offer less power but are slightly more consistent. Ultimately, however, in this final slot, we want to be running an awakened cold damage support, ideally at level 5. At that level, it not only provides a heap of added cold damage, but also increases the level of supported cold gems by 1, making this an ideal but very optional 6th gem. Proceeding onward now to our Frostbolt setup. This will ideally be a 6th link, located in our body armor, though we'll be discussing budget setups as well. Frostbolt itself is a slow-moving cold-based projectile that pierces every enemy it hits. We'll be linking it first to faster casting, for the, well, faster casting. Greater multiple projectiles adds 4 additional projectiles to each cast of Frostbolt. This gives our Ice Novas more potential targets, substantially increasing both our effective range and area of effect. Curse on hit applies linked curses to enemies hit by our Frostbolts. We'll be utilizing Frostbite to significantly lower their cold resistance and increase our chance of freezing them. In our final socket, we'll be linking an Arcane Surge, specifically at level 7. This buff triggers when we spend mana on supported skills, in this case casting Frostbolt. Arcane Surge grants us more spell damage, increased cast speed, and a large amount of mana regeneration. We want to level it as high as possible, while ensuring that the mana needed to trigger it is equivalent to or less than the mana cost of the skill it's supporting. This guarantees that every cast of Frostbolt will proc a fresh Arcane Surge buff. An alternative setup for those who choose to run a Curse Ring instead will look something like this. Simply swap out the Curse setup for other unlinked gems, like buffs or low-level auras. For those with an extremely high budget, a setup like this, featuring a level 5 Awakened Curse on hit, offers the opportunity to double curse enemies, allowing for the addition of an extra curse like Assassin's Mark. And if you don't yet have a 6-linked body armor, you can temporarily replace faster casting with a now level 6 Arcane Surge to account for the lowered mana cost. In the empty unlinked socket, you can place one of our miscellaneous buffs or low-level auras. Or alternatively, Arcane Surge can be added temporarily to our Flame Dash setup, an option I'll discuss in more detail momentarily. Our next setup is a 2-link and 2 unlinked skills that can be socketed flexibly into our helmet, boots, or gloves. The 2-link is composed of Flame Dash and Second Wind support. Flame Dash is an instant travel skill that can store up to 3 uses. Second Wind lowers the cooldown recovery speed of Flame Dash and grants an additional maximum use. In the remaining sockets, we'll be running a level 1 Precision to keep its mana reservation low, and a Vaal Haste at as high a level as your dexterity will allow. We won't be using the actual Haste aura, so don't activate it. We're only using the Vaal portion of the skill for its large temporary buff to our cast speed. If you want to temporarily run Arcane Surge in this setup, I recommend a 3-link like this, with either Precision or Vaal Haste being switched to the unlinked socket in your chest piece. Arcane Surge will have to be lowered to level 3, as the mana cost of Flame Dash is significantly lower. Marching ahead, it's time to discuss our cast when damage taken setup, a 4-link composed of these gems at these exact levels. This setup can be socketed flexibly into our helmet, boots, or gloves. When cast when damage taken's damage threshold is met, it automatically triggers any linked spells that have a required level equivalent to or less than that of cast when damage taken itself. We'll be keeping cast when damage taken at level 1 to ensure that it activates frequently. When it does, it will trigger a level 3 Immortal Call, which heavily reduces incoming elemental and physical damage for a short time. Immortal Call will consume endurance charges we've generated to lengthen its buff and reduce incoming physical damage further. Increased duration extends the duration of Immortal Call and also applies the same effect to the linked Vaal Grace. Like Vaal Haste, do not activate the actual Grace aura, only use the Vaal portion of the skill. Level up Vaal Grace as high as your dexterity will easily allow. When manually activated, for a short duration, Vaal Grace will grant a large chance to dodge both attacks and spells, providing a very meaningful defensive layer in key moments. Our last full-fledged setup will be a 3-link and an unlinked skill. Once again, this setup can be placed flexibly into our helmet, boots, or gloves. The 3-link is composed of our debuffs, Frost Bomb applies cold exposure, heavily lowering enemies' cold resistance. Cold Snap primarily applies chilled ground, which in turn inflicts chill. Both skills will be linked to Bone Chill support, which increases the effect of chill and causes chilled enemies to take increased cold damage, magnifying our damage output against them heavily. In the last unlinked slot, we'll be running Vaal Righteous Fire. Once again, don't use the regular Righteous Fire, only the Vaal portion. During Vaal Righteous Fire's effect, we'll be granted as much as 28% more spell damage, but when activated, instantly sacrifices 30% of our total life and energy shield. We tend to recover exceptionally quickly from this, but keep it in mind. This buff is best used in boss fights, in other circumstances where huge bursts of damage are required. Finally, in the primary version of the build, we'll be running 2 Essence Worm unique rings. These allow us to reserve expensive ores for free, keeping our reserved mana untouched. In the first, we'll be running the aura Hatred, for the up to 19% more cold damage that it grants. In the second, we'll be running Zealotry, for the increased critical strike chance, up to 16% more spell damage, and chance to create consecrated ground. And with that, the skills and links are completely wrapped up. Let's continue onward and discuss how to best map and fight bosses with this build. For reference, here are the exact keybinds that I used. This of course comes down to personal preference, so treat this as a baseline to be modified in any way you see fit. When mapping, try to keep your utility and mana flasks up consistently. Try to avoid self-casting Ice Nova, as it will lock your character into a spellcasting loop. This should really only be used to clean up stragglers. Make frequent use of Flame Dash to quickly traverse empty space and disengage from fights when needed. Activate Vaal Haste and Grace as often as you see fit, and trigger Vaal Righteous Fire if the damage output is needed. Our primary method of dealing damage is casting Frostbolt in the direction of nearby enemies, and applying several Ice Novas across multiple projectiles to maximize area of effect. This standard method can be modified in a variety of ways. We can cast and forget by simply building up a large amount of Ice Novas on a Frostbolt cast and letting it fly ahead of us or even off screen. Ideal when engaging dangerous situations from a distance or when engaging stationary league mechanics such as Blight. We can cast and cover by launching Frostbolts and quickly ducking behind cover. You can rapidly cast Ice Novas from a safe location. We can cast and follow. When clearing long stretches of enemies, you can follow a single cast of Frostbolt as it travels, letting the repeats do the work, while occasionally adding fresh Ice Novas when needed. Finally, we can cast and dash. This is ideal for clearing maps quickly, and with practice, can achieve some great results. Make quick Frostbolt Ice Nova setups in the direction of anything moving, and continue quickly onward in search of new enemies. Trust in your Ice Novas and their repeats to clear for you, and listen for the sound of good drops. Try to make good use of all Ice Nova in the situations in which it thrives. Don't hesitate to use it defensively if you end up getting surrounded. In typical boss encounters, quickly apply both Frost Bomb and Cold Snap to the boss's location to lower their cold resistance and magnify our cold damage against them. From there, quickly use your utility flasks, pop Vaal Righteous Fire, and Vaal Haste and Vaal Grace if needed. These keybinds should be set up in a way that you can hit quickly and consistently. The instant our flasks and buffs are up, cast Frostbolt and lay down as many Ice Novas as possible. The more you cast, the more damage you'll do. This will likely chain freeze most weaker bosses and should end the majority of fights incredibly quickly. Against high health or high mobility opponents, precise timing of your Ice Novas is going to be key. Now that we've covered all of the build's fundamentals, let's take a brief look at how to best level it up. Here are the stages of progression that we'll be taking on the skill tree: early leveling, mid-game leveling, early endgame, and optimized endgame. These trees can be found in the path of building by selecting this tab. If you're leveling this as a league starter, simply use the best rare gear that you can find, and make good use of these commonly found flasks. Head back to your hideout occasionally to craft elemental resistances and life rolls onto your gear. Alternatively, if you're running this as a later character and have currency available, here are some of the best uniques you can pick up for a smooth experience. Early on, I recommend running these skills in setups that look like this, before transitioning into an Ice Nova and Frostbolt setup like this around level 38, when important support gems like GMP and Spell Echo first become available. Ice Nova can be effectively scaled from this point onward into the endgame, and as we approach endgame mapping, here are the map modifiers to keep in mind. This build can run just about everything without any issues. The only modifier we can't run whatsoever is Monsters Reflect percentage of elemental damage. The modifiers below that just prove slightly annoying, but are doable. And with that, it's finally time that we move into the endgame gear that defines the build. Path of Exile has a player-driven economy, meaning that the cost of items is at the mercy of supply and demand, and may shift over time. As a result, I'll be using these broad tiers of price to better estimate the future cost of an item. Now let's begin with our endgame weapon selection, the powerful and surprisingly cheap Pledge of Hands. This unique staff grants a high amount of spell block, up to 160% increased spell damage, and an impressive 100% increased maximum mana. But the true driving force of the weapon is the level 30 greater spell echo and the 2 additional Ice Nova repeats that it provides, magnifying both our damage output and overall clear speed significantly. If you're playing this in solo self-found, or as a league starter, for as long as needed, you can run a rare staff like this with an emphasis on the listed modifiers, or a Terran Shiver, which is typically very affordable, even at the start of a league. If you're on a tight budget, utilize the cheap Prophecy Jeweler's Touch for an instant 5-link that will get you mapping quickly. Up next is our choice of helmet. The easiest recommendation is simply running a flexibly priced rare, like this, with an emphasis on these modifiers. If you have the currency to burn, look for some of the expensive modifiers listed here. Alternatively, we can utilize a variety of cheap unique options that benefit the build in very different ways. No helmet enchantments are even remotely required, but if you have the currency, here's some of the best options available. Next on the list is our body armor. My core recommendation is the cheap Cloak of Defiance, which offers a healthy amount of both evasion rating and energy shield, as well as a huge amount of flat mana and mana regeneration, while also granting us the keystone Mind Over Matter and increasing its effectiveness by 10%, combining with Divine Guidance to reach 50% of damage taken as mana before life. This allows us to scale our effective mana pool far higher, increases our actual mana pool pretty significantly, reducing the strain on other gear, and frees up the skill point we would have spent on Mind Over Matter to be spent on something else. For those who want to go with an alternative, I recommend getting a Clarity Watcher's Eye with this modifier to maintain our 50% effectiveness Mind Over Matter. You can consider running a rare chest piece like this with an emphasis on the listed modifiers. If you're on a high budget and go this route, consider some of the listed expensive modifiers. You can even get the 10% of damage taken from mana before life. Also worth some consideration are these cheap uniques. And for those on a very high budget, the ultimate damage-focused chest piece, as it is for many builds, will be Feral's Fur, which makes the aura aspect of the cat completely free and grants consistent access to both frenzy and power charges. This will require crafting or purchasing a rare item that grants level 20 aspect of the cat. Once again, if you're on a very tight budget, combine any of these options besides Loreweave with Jeweler's Touch for an instant 5-link. Proceeding on now to our gloves. These will be flexibly priced rares like this, with an emphasis on these modifiers. Ideally, try to find the up to 50% increased damage against chilled enemies modifier. Our boots will once again be flexibly priced rares, with an emphasis on the listed modifiers. This league in particular, boots that grant Tailwind on critical strike are surprisingly affordable, and heavily recommended if you can get them, though these may be more expensive in future leagues. Our ideal enchantment is the 80% chance to avoid being stunned if you've killed recently. This makes a massive difference to the mapping experience by keeping us casting uninterrupted. I heavily recommend either buying a pre-enchanted base for crafting or farming for it in Uber Lab with a good pair of boots. Next up is our amulet selection, ideally being the expensive Pandemonious, a truly incredible amulet for the build, offering solid increases to a variety of helpful modifiers, but most notably penetrating an impressive 20% of enemies' cold resistance and blinding all chilled enemies on hit. This increases our damage heavily and jumps our almost non-existent chance to evade to over 50% against blinded enemies. Be sure to fully quality the Pandemonious with Turbulent Catalysts to maximize its increases to cold damage and cold penetration. Alternatively, you can run a flexibly priced rare like this with these modifiers. A strong rare can do great work for as long as needed. Once you have an amulet that you feel comfortable running, be sure to anoint it by speaking with Cassia and providing the correct oil recipe. Here are my top recommendations to fit various budgets. Ultimately, we want to run Heart of Ice for the potent damage increase and easy access to Energy Shield Leech. For both of our rings, we'll be running 2 cheap Essence Worm uniques, giving us the ability to run Hatred and Zealotry while keeping our entire mana pool unreserved. Alternatively, for those who don't want to run our curse setup on Frostbolt, you'll have to drop one of our Essence Worms, and consequently one of our endgame auras. In return, you can run an Assassin's Mark ring. This setup curses more consistently, but requires some serious sacrifice. Forging onward, let's talk about our belt. This will be a flexibly priced rare that looks something like this, with an emphasis on these modifiers. A leather belt can be a solid budget choice, but a Stygian vise is heavily advised, so that we can place a powerful Hypnotic Eye jewel within it. With that, we've covered the majority of the core gear. So now let's talk about the flasks. In our first slot, I recommend a cheap Quicksilver flask with a flexible prefix and a suffix featuring an additional movement speed roll. Alternatively, consider sacrificing some of that movement speed and look for a moderately priced Quicksilver flask of the Order that features one of these two powerful crafted mods. In our second slot, we have a cheap Diamond flask, which makes our critical strike chance lucky, causing the game to roll twice to see if we've crit before taking the best result. This increases our effective critical strike chance significantly, and in turn, our damage output. Once again, the prefix is flexible, but the suffix should be of heat for the crucial immunity to freeze and chill. Alternatively, you can consider looking for one of the powerful of Order modifiers we just mentioned. Keep in mind that multiple iterations of the same modifier will not stack. If you go this route, ensure that freeze and chill immunity is on a different flask. Our third slot is very flexible. You can get good budget value out of a Silver flask, which grants the buff Onslaught, increasing our movement and cast speed by 20%. Both the prefix and suffix are flexible here. We can shore up additional immunities, pick up increased cast speed, or even look for of Order modifiers. Alternatively, here are some cheap unique and magic options worth consideration in this slot. And if you're on a higher budget, I very heavily recommend picking up an expensive Cinder Swallow, which grants Onslaught and a powerful of Order modifier, while also providing percentage life, energy shield, and mana recovery on kill. This recovery becomes very significant when killing lots of mobs, and can prove life-saving in many circumstances. If you go this route, I advise getting an Abyssal Jewel that grants a decent roll of added fire damage to our spells. This grants a small chance to ignite and significantly increases our damage output against enemies that are ignited. In our fourth slot, I recommend running a cheap, Enduring Eternal Mana Flask of Warding. In this build, mana is effectively life, and we benefit heavily from keeping it replenished. Look for the Enduring prefix, which prevents the flask effect from being removed upon reaching full mana, and the suffix of Warding, providing immunity to curses. In our final slot, I recommend running a cheap Divine Life flask with a flexible prefix and a suffix of Staunching for the immunity to bleeding. For those on an exceptionally high budget, the expensive Bottled Faith is a ridiculously good flask and should be utilized if possible. This will require sacrifice to cram into the build and will likely need to replace either a Quicksilver or a Life flask. And that brings us to our final section, the jewels of the build. Let's discuss the cluster jewels first. On screen now are some of the best modifiers available to the build, and a variety of well-rolled examples that feature them. Since the crafting changes, very solid jewels have become extremely expensive and aren't easily attainable for every player. In the POB, I'll be including 2 additional skill trees that make partial and full use of cluster jewels. The overall setup is pretty flexible. You can achieve great results in a variety of ways. Feel free to customize your setup with a combination of the options seen here. This will depend heavily on the stage of the league you're playing and the rarity of the specific jewel you're looking for. The many remaining sockets on the tree will be occupied by flexibly priced Cobalt jewels. Look for examples like these, and prioritize the listed modifiers. If you're running a Stygian Vise, I recommend looking for a flexibly priced Hypnotic Eye jewel that has modifiers like these. If you're running a Cinder Swallow, be sure to get that roll of added fire damage to spells. There are a variety of flexibly priced Watcher's Eyes that we can make good use of. Here are all the beneficial Hatred, Zealotry, Precision, and Clarity modifiers that we can look for. Special mention of the Clarity modifier, up to 10% of damage taken from Mana Before Life. This is recommended if you're not going with Cloak of Defiance, and basically required if you're going with the ultra defensive version of the build. Otherwise, the modifiers you choose to look for are up to you. Finally, for those interested, here are the music tracks and MTX that were used in the video. And with that, I think I've covered just about everything. If you end up giving this build a shot, I hope the guide serves you incredibly well. Thank you to all of my patrons for their continued support of the channel. It's truly appreciated and makes this content possible to produce. Special recognition goes to the following patrons for their dedicated support: Agent Leo, Andrew Miller, Austin Meredith, Beanie, Bloody, Bryce Gaston, Christopher Cravey, Chris IRL, Christopher Murdoch, Daniel Wigg, Darren Clark, David Cantu, Duke Nguyen, Gareth Thomas, Garth Anderson, Greg Wells, Hunter Wild, Jacob Davey, John Snyder, Kevin Griffin, Kevin Langevin, Kurt Wood, Lukash Galik, Michael Johnson, Mick Woodney, Mihai, Modimus Prime, Nate, Piotr, Rasmus Blokpelsko, Ray Hill, Rene Gosser, Richard Bollinger, Ryan McDonald, Sabaton Babylon, Sinister Data, Spencer Ripe, Stefan RCH, Tony G, Truzato, Varos Vitele, Wyatt Sabled, Xi, and Solaris. Thank you so much, everyone. An extra thank you to Darren Clark and Modimus Prime for the generous support. And a final thank you to Modimus Prime, Snowy Snowwolf, and Greg Wells for your assistance. If you'd like to be credited at the end of each of my videos, or join our Discord for Path of Exile and channel discussion, consider checking out the Patreon link in the description below. If you have any questions or feedback, leave it down below and I'll do my best to answer. If you enjoyed the video, consider subbing to the channel for more coming build guides. And as always, I've been Esero, and I will see you guys in the next video.